Good morning, everybody. How's
Another
everybody doing?
good. Another wonderful real estate day.
Exactly. I'm sorry to hear, Alexa, you didn't win the lottery.
I know I had the island all picked out.
Well, it's
I
more,
had a lot of comments on that. It was fun.
yeah, they say a lot of people that win the lottery winds up being miserable for them. So good thing you
Oh,
didn't.
oh, I say I could try though. Yeah.
So, anyway, for today's session, if you are somewhere where you have a camera, if you could put your camera on, I want to try to be a little bit more interactive this time, if you're appropriate, of course. Um, Today we're going to talk about negotiations and, it might seem, to be very intuitive, but sometimes it helps to think about some of the things that we do. Um, if you give me a second, I'm just going to crank up my document. And does anybody have any or any of our lenders have any comments? I think rates are going to be moving favorably.
Yeah, is Frank on today? It's
Yeah, I think he's traveling, so
okay. I mean, I could
he's in the
definitely
air.
jump in. So we just got our jobs
Great.
report
No
back, which
sound.
was definitely better than expected. But those are March numbers, so they're a little bit down from where they were last month. But if you guys are watching what's happening with the stock market versus the bond
Yes, if you
market,
sit
our
there.
rates, yeah.
Hold on one second. Let me just mute everyone.
Okay, do you want to?
Here, Tiffany, unmute yourself. Go ahead.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, so the big thing that we were waiting for, obviously, was the job report. We base a lot of our information on what's going to happen with the job report. So it came out much better than expected. Even though it's down from when they released it, those numbers are really from March, which did give a positive result to the interest rates. So we are literally down to, I locked someone in at 6.375 yesterday. So we're doing much better than we were. We're on a downward trend, although there are some indication that things are going to increase a little bit with all of these tariffs and all of the scariness that's going on with all these retaliation tariffs. So we'll see what happens next week. I would just say that if I had to guess, I would say we're going to get a rate cut probably sometime in May or June, which is going to help us a little bit to hopefully spark a little bit more of the market, especially in New Jersey. We're trying to get people off the fence, and these rates aren't helping, but they are coming down, which is great. And if you're working with another lender, which hopefully you're always giving Cornerstone an opportunity, but if you are, check with your lender on where the rates are for your pre-approvals, because the difference between 6 and a quarter or 6.375 versus 6.875 could be $10,000 or $20,000 in purchase power. So absolutely go back into your own individual pipeline, check to see where your pre-approvals are sitting, and see if there's anything that you can do to increase their purchase power. Thank you.
Wonderful. Where's is the 10-year still below 4?
I think it was 4.1 last time I checked.
All
I
right.
can definitely look at that for you.
No worries. So we're not getting the easy button here. So that means that we need to be intentional in what we do. I'm going to talk a little bit about the do's and don'ts of negotiating. And before we go into the do's and don'ts, I want to kind of set a framework for it. Um, I'm sure many of you have never heard of a gentleman by the name of Bob Berg. He wrote a book, I think 20 or 30 years ago, called Endless Referrals. And he has a quote in there. People are more likely to do business with those they know, like, and trust because it makes them feel valued and understood. People are more likely to do business with those they know, like, and trust because it makes them feel more valued and understood. Okay. So does that have any meaning to anybody on this call? Like, what is your initial reaction if we're talking about negotiations and I make that statement?
You don't
I
have
have a
to.
comment from Arizona. We
Go
just,
ahead.
I mean, this is kind of one of those no kidding situations. Absolutely. Obviously, you're going to go with the person you trust. I mean, right now, I'm dealing with a buyer that I bought their house, sold their house, referred them to an agent up in Phoenix. And the agent called me and said, hey, can you push them over the edge to accept this counteroffer that we just got because they trust you? It, once you build trust, it's something that you have to maintain for a lifetime, but it's probably the most valuable part in your relationship.
So Wilson, you're part of our leadership team down in Tucson. Now,
Mm.
have you ever seen an agent that wants to get something done and they start by being confrontational, maybe with the other agent?
Yes,
And,
seen it and had it happen.
right, you've been on, you've observed, and I'm sure you've probably been on situations where somebody wants to get an offer accepted on your listing, or you're looking to do a transaction. There's motivation, but out of ignorance and frustration, they become aggressive. Well,
Yeah.
that's one of the don'ts. Okay, because people do business with people they know, like, and trust. We're not like everybody else, but we want to try to highlight some of the similarities and emphasize the common goal. Okay, many of us have agents that um, in the industry that deserve or maybe are suspected for not being the most trustworthy in their negotiations. But it doesn't do us any good to alienate them or to argue with them, because you can win the argument, but you won't get the sale, right? Um, you know, a recent and when I say contract negotiations, what are you thinking mostly about, or negotiations in real estate? What comes to mind most?
I always think of the
Listings.
Benzer period.
You think of what?
The Benzer period.
What
I think
period?
that's when Benzer, the buyer inspection notice seller response period.
Okay.
It's,
I never heard it called that.
You
oh yeah,
have to hang out in Arizona more.
Okay.
we're Benzer state. Yeah, it's because that's when the real negotiating starts. Sure, you get it in the original purchase offer, but like I tell my clients, we're playing a long game here. We have two sets of negotiations. One is the original offer, and then two is after we find everything wrong with the property, and that's where my skills come to the table.
So, and what I'm going to do here is I'm going to dig a little bit deeper here, Wilson, and say that, you're negotiating with your buyer to get them to make an offer, or a reasonable offer, correct?
Yeah.
Um, you know, e- Even before that, you're negotiating with yourself to get out of bed early and go to work. So there's a study from Columbia found that we're bogged down with more than 70 negotiations a day. Okay. And we probably don't realize that, but there's a lot of negotiations. And the worst negotiation is the one that you don't even know you're in. Okay. And that's a quote from Chris Voss, a FBI hostage negotiator. And I think he's spoken at a few Remax events. So if you've ever seen him, his material is pretty good. Um, so let's recognize, in order to have a better outcome, that there's a lot more negotiations than just the obvious, and having an awareness of these negotiations that we don't even know we're in is these are imperative to helping us improve our odds for success. Um, the survival instinct is 75% negative, okay, according to studies. Um, the reason why I bring that up is, if we're negotiating with somebody and our offer isn't being readily accepted or isn't being favorably received, what comes to mind? Anybody?
It's
We become defensive and aggressive.
Do you think agents might think, oh, Colleen has her own client making an offer, and that's why mine's not being accepted, as opposed to maybe it's not the best offer, or maybe I'm not presenting it under the best light? What do you think?
Absolutely. They're always suspicious.
That's why I
It's
say it. That's why I say it's like 75% of it is negative, right? We're assuming that somebody's doing something wrong behind our back. It could never be us, right?
Yep, it's the lizard brain.
Yep. And I'm gonna take some quotes from a old mastermind that I did, and I'm gonna just put these out there, and these are in the attachment to the email that you received. Handwriting notes anchor them in your brain. Handwriting notes anchor them in your brain. So if you pull up the attachment and you write down what you think is most critical for you to improve your skills, writing it down actually helps. Um, Seek first to understand, then confirm your understanding, and this makes the other side feel understood. Okay. So an example would be, um, it sounds like you're saying that this house is only worth $650,000. Am I hearing you correctly? Right? And then what you can do is um, you can break down the motivation for that belief. Okay. Um, and if you get it right, it releases positive oxytoc oxytocins to the brain. That's not an illicit drug. That's a natural chemical, which is a bonding drug. Okay, so that will make you feel more connected and more effective in negotiating. And I'm going to say that this is not a manipulative thing, right? Because if I'm going to take like that 75% rule, I think 75% of the time, our customers aren't being fully transparent with us because they have that negative defense mechanism. And what we want to do is we want to get them to not just, say, hey, I'm being transparent with my agent, but I want them to have it be subconsciously transparent with the agent to get what they want. Right? Does anybody ever feel like clients have sabotaged offers for de minimis amounts and it's been really frustrating for you? Has anybody ever felt that? And for lenders like you, Tiffany, do you ever feel like a lender like went with another company because they claimed to be $300 less and it might not have even been true?
100%. Yes, it happens all the time.
And I'm going to say to you, it's more about the way you make them feel than the absolute dollars. And there's probably 25% that culturally are going to, look at the absolute dollars and believe whatever is told to them. But 75% of the people are going to factor in the whole process, which is the expense, the product, and most importantly, the way you make them feel in the conversation. Okay. Um, and let's see. So, repeating what you heard is a great way to build trust in a relationship. Um, Abandon the mindset of um, when you're negotiating, like, I'm embarrassed to ask questions. Okay. Um, Sometimes, if you really master the art of negotiation, you'll intentionally allow them to correct you because when you allow them to correct you, you give them the ability to feel a little bit elevated and more comfortable completing the negotiation. Okay. So, you might say something like, you know, so if you had to wait an extra month to close, that would be a deal breaker, even if you had the right price. And they might say, no, 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 we can go, we can deal with an extra month, right? So you're learning more about them and allowing them to kind of expand the parameters of what you're looking to do. Um,
Yeah, you're almost letting them play defense rather than offense.
mm-hmm. And did anybody ever hear people talk about like, getting people to say yes and yes and yes to try to get to the outcome, kind of like that yes mentality? Well, Chris Voss had pointed out like uh, the yes process has been overplayed and maybe done. He said, try things like, are you against? Hey, is it ridiculous if you paid $5,000 more and you got that house that really made sense for you? Or does it seem like a bad idea if you gave them an extra month to close, but you got your price? Right? So when you say, does it seem like it? No, it doesn't. It seems like a good idea. So you can try, doing the inverse, right? Are you against? Is it ridiculous? Do you disagree? Um, and
Is yes backfiring?
well,
Oh no.
I think it's been overplayed.
Oh wow. Okay.
Okay. So and again, this is everybody's results and everybody's style's a little bit different. But years ago, they used to say, get them to say yes to this, yes to that, yes to this, and then,
I
hey,
mean, Voss was my Bible. I went by what he said, and now I think you're right. It's overplayed.
yep.
Oh,
So when you say, are you against, right? You say, no, I'm not against it, right? Because a lot of times people want to say no to us. But if you say, are you against, spending, 5% more if you got the right house? No, 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 I'm not against that. Okay. Um, the trigger of the no gives the other side the feeling that they're protected, while the yes may let them feel a little bit more vulnerable. Okay. Um, Chris Voss says that 70% of people, and this is his gut feeling, can be trusted blindly. However, the cost of betrayal flips you to the other side because when you've been betrayed, it puts up your defense mechanisms. Okay. And it's important for you to kind of understand that there's a bias to being trusted. However, the consequence of trust being violated is significant, especially in a financial transaction. Um, and then on the bottom of the note, it says, "Let's recap. Let's recap what I hear you saying. Is you want to move, and you understand that the market is hot. You've been looking for a while, and nothing's caught your eye, and you need more space, right? And then, you're basically looking for how they respond to that, so that you can interject, right? You're building trust by asking questions." Um, Now, this is something that I think I understand. In Beth, in Arizona, when you take a listing, do you negotiate the buyer side at the time of the listing most of the time, never, or always?
I talk about what the seller, there's one thing about pricing a piece of property, but typically, the buyer's going to come in and they're going to ask for compensation, or they may ask for closing costs, or they may ask for some repairs or any number of things. And so it's important to not just look at price, but to look at net.
Right, but do you say at that appointment that I recommend, or if somebody calls, I say that we're paying 2.5%, or do you let the buyer's agent request what they're looking for?
I let the buyer's agent request it. In fact, I've never called the seller's agent to find out if they're paying or what they're paying for that same reason. It's the negotiation in the contract.
Now, Florida, that's foreign to us there, right? Or is anybody in Florida operating that way now?
Pretty much the same when the buyer's agents called, they asked what we're paying. We had a class on this on Tuesday. We talked about it. So buyer's agent calls, they're going to ask, are you paying? Well, what is the compensation? And then we'll tell them what it is, 2.5 or 3%.
Right, but that's different. So, Ron, what they do in Arizona is you negotiate your listing side, and then you tell the homeowner that we'll evaluate I don't want to say, but Gary, can you comment on that? So, for most of the listings or all the listings, if I'm the home seller, can you just tell me what I can expect if you're able to talk?
Well, and that's something that just recently changed. I believe February 1st, we've got a new listing agreement that took out the part that the seller's agreeing to pay to the buyer broker. So now when, most agents, when they go out, they say, this is what we charge. If there's an unrepresented buyer involved, this is what we also are going to charge. And then you should expect, or could expect, the buyer broker coming in asking, or the buyer coming in asking for some compensation for their buyer broker. But the new box for us in that area is, does the seller give us permission to say that the seller is willing to look at those offers with compensation for the buyer broker? Or does the seller not want us to say that? So we've taken out the buyer broker part at listing time in the listing contract and left it up to whatever the offer is and what the buyer's agent is asking for compensation.
And
one thing to add there, Rob, too, is keep in mind this was the whole basis of the lawsuit, is not having clear communication and allowing proper negotiation of commissions. So what Arizona's done is allowed and basically put it in the face of the buyer and seller, saying, we are making you negotiate now our commissions, but the caveat is, as a buyer, you guys are going to negotiate it, but I do charge 3% to work. So it allows the agent to still set it similar to that of an attorney. I work for $400 an hour. Well, you now get to choose if you want to pay $400 an hour for that attorney. Same with real estate agents out here. Now you get to choose, do I want to pay 3% of my purchase price if the seller is not offering compensation? Or do I want to pay the 1.5 if the seller's offering 1.5? It allows for total communication and an open flow to the transaction.
so Arizona agents only, how do you feel about this process?
Love it.
You love it, Beth?
I love
I
it.
like it.
I love it.
Yeah. In fact, this same process is happening in other states. And it's actually creating a cleaner transaction. And honestly, I'm getting a higher percentage since all this happened. Look
When
at Wilson shaking his head, yes.
You're saying, Beth, on the buyer side, you're getting a higher percentage, correct?
I am. I'm asking for a higher amount in the contract, or they are. And a good percentage of the time we're getting it.
Now, if you can put yourself on camera, and if by show of hands, if you're not in Arizona, who likes this? Put your hand up. Who likes it? And who hates it? We have a lot of Rob Garver. You didn't have an opinion on it? I didn't see your hand go up either way.
I had my hand up saying,
Y-
yes, I like it.
So you like the idea of letting the buyer's agent negotiate their own commission, correct?
Wait a minute, isn't Rob retired?
Rob Garver? No,
I thought he was retired.
no.
It's just
Oh.
managing the office.
Oh,
So-
okay.
So who wants to say that? I've gotten calls from New Jersey agents and one Florida agent saying that this is the end of the industry because they're not telling us what they're paying. Who wants to take the side of, I like it the way it was, I don't like this? And Donna, you probably got calls too, right?
Almost every day.
Where they're upset, and maybe I'd use a word beyond upset, begins with a P, because the other agent's saying just submit what you're looking to get paid in the offer.
That is correct.
How come nobody's saying anything?
Rob, I think that it comes back to the point where when this first started to come up, the key was going to be an agent's ability to prove their worth. And I think agents who are uncomfortable with that conversation appreciated the fact that there was no guesswork involved. You knew you were getting 2.5%, and you didn't have to say anything, so that was a good deal. But like I'm sure like Beth feels, you know, I'm a really good agent. I deserve to get paid what I think I deserve to get paid. And this gives me an opportunity to prove my case to the seller.
And I'm even going to say for New Jersey and for Florida folks that I've had calls from some of our top agents that said, you know what, I've lost a listing to somebody who that says the seller is willing to review compensation, submit it with your offer, and they believe, maybe rightfully, maybe incorrectly, that they lost the listing because they were saying my fee, my total compensation is 5.5% or 6% or 5, because they set the expectation, they put a price tag on what's going out to the other side, and somebody else came in, and if I explained to you, Adona, that hey, the fee is 2.5% for my side, I'm going to put out 2% to buyers agents to attract them, blah blah blah. At the end of that meeting, you have what number in your mind?
4.5.
Or 5, right?
5.
Whatever the total is. And then if somebody else comes in and says, look I'm going to charge you 3%, and then we're going to take a look at what other people bring in, you can decide if you want to pay a compensation. What number is in your mind? 2.5 or 3, right?
2.5, like on the listing side, correct?
Yeah, but then
So
you're fixing your commission with the seller. Everything's got to be negotiable. When I go for a listing appointment, I try to negotiate our commission with the seller to have them agree on a 5% or 6% or whatever percent we choose. And then I ask them, listen, we would like to give 2%, or if it's a 4% listing or 5% listing, we'd like to give half of that to the buyer's broker. And that's how, we'd like to negotiate.
But the whole concept of negotiating doesn't mean you need to settle. My commission is 3%, I told my sellers, and they say, well, can you do 2.5? It's negotiable, but no, I'm not negotiating my own. It is negotiable, but I'm staying firm on 3%. I'm negotiating.
right, so
I just
Ron,
don't like leaving it up and open-ended. I just like to have a fixed number so that we agree on it. So
Yeah.
if
right,
my
so
seller says 5%, then I know, I'll either keep 3 and give 2 away, or keep 2.5, give 2.5 away. So
Ron, other than it being outside the norm, right? What's wrong with saying, can you submit your offer with what you're looking to get compensated, and my seller will review the entire offer?
but that's another that's another approach to negotiating, but
So, Rob,
I guess it's up to everybody's personality, how they want to do it.
So Rob, I just want to add something really quickly. So especially for New Jersey agents, because I don't want them to be confused. When you're going to a listing appointment, you cannot have a fixed amount for the buyer either. You need to go and say, hey, Mr. Seller, for me to sell your house, my fee is 2.5, 3, 2, whatever you're comfortable with what your value is, right? Then you go into the buyers. You can't just say, hey, it's 5% and then I will give out 2 or 2.5 to the buyer. That was the whole lawsuit. So don't go there and say my commission is 5 or 6. You have to just say what your fee is fixed on your to sell their house. So whether it's 2, 2.5, or 3%. I just want to make sure that that is clarified. Every state might do it differently, but for New Jersey, please just keep that in mind. Don't tell them my fee is 5 or 6%, because you never know. You might end up meeting someone who's gonna report you, and that was like the whole settlement. You have to give them the option.
Right, but Adoni,
Negotiate.
you can't say when somebody inquires, I call you up and I say, Adona, is your seller offering compensation? You can't say the seller has authorized me to say we're paying out 2.5%.
You can, if your seller agreed, but you can't go to the seller and say, Rob, my fee's 5% and I'm gonna give out 2.5. You have to let the seller decide what they want to offer. You have to say that. So
So
I'm gonna go to the seller and say, for me to sell your house, my fee's 3% or 2, let's say 2.5. What do you want to offer the buyer's agent? What's my option?
Yep.
So then you give them the opportunity. You can't decide how much the split is, how much you want to offer out to the buyer's agent. It has to be the seller. If the seller says 2.5, then yes, you can. If somebody calls you and say, is your seller cooperating? You're going to say yes. They're going to say how much? 2.5. But you can't decide for the seller. Like you can't tell the seller how much you're splitting your 5% or your 6%.
I mean, I think it's
The other
it's a,
thing here with
oh,
that is, let's say, like like Ron, what you said, if you go in there and you say, well, we're going to offer 2.5% to the buyer's agent or 2% to the buyer's agent, and I'm taking 3, you've already negotiated that at the time of the listing. That's great. But what if I come in and I write an offer on yours and I know I'm worth 3%? You've already set the expectation for your seller that they're paying 2%. Now I come in and ask for 3, and they're going to come back to you. The relationship, we're back to trust. Now the relationship's gone. Well, why did you have me agree to 2% if they want 3? That's where that's this whole lawsuit. Like Adona just said, the whole lawsuit was based off of antitrust of real estate agents and no clear-cut communication between buyer seller's agents. The biggest thing here is let the buyer walk into the house and prove their worth. There's their buyer's agent. If you want 3%, you better negotiate that, because you've already proved 3% to your buyers. So your buyers are now fighting for your worth. That's the clear-cut negotiation tactics that are required by this lawsuit. The other way of saying, I take 5.5% and I give 2.5%, you are open to a lawsuit. Black and white right there.
Well, I want to add to that. And when you look at a sale price, for example, and you submit an offer and a seller says, there's no way I'll take less than 600,000, period, end of story. You know, legally, if somebody offers 580, you've got to submit the offer for 580, period. And then it can be negotiated. And the same thing happens with compensation. The seller can say, I am willing to pay 0 to a buyer's agent. And they can still come in and they are a buyer broker, and they can come in and offer, you know, in that offer, say, I want you to pay my buyer broker 3% or 2.5% or whatever the number is. And it's on the table. We still have to submit it, even if the listing agent has said, my seller is going to refuse to pay it, because once that's right in front of them, they need to, I mean, you put pen to paper, they're going to have to say, I'm not going to accept this offer, even though it's only 20,000 less or whatever. If we're talking about sale price only, you have to submit it, and they will change their minds when they actually see it in writing. And I have only had one absolutely unequivocal base say no, and it was Open Door. That's the only one that I've ever had say no. And it's really interesting because now their listings are showing a compensation being paid because they weren't
The
being.
other thing is, we have colleagues in this world that have been doing this for years. Call your commercial friends. This is how commercial has been done since fire was created. There's a reason that you will never go through that lawsuit. I challenge anyone to find it. If you find it, let me know and I'll buy you a beer or lunch or a steak dinner, whatever you want, because you're not going to find it. There was never a commercial agent included in the lawsuit because they have been doing this forever.
so,
It's us residential guys that are pushing back on this, but we need to get with the times, honestly.
all right.
Hi,
So,
this is
so
Rebecca in Florida. I have a question. So when you go in and you offer that 3% for your commission, brokerage commission, what happens if you double side that listing? It's a 3% compensation that you're getting?
well,
No,
you
so that's a conversation you have to have with them. And that's where in Arizona we have the unrepresented buyer form, and we also have the dual representation form. So there's 2 different areas that we do it, where if it's an unrepresented buyer, here's how much, because we have to provide them with our Arizona Association realtor forms. We have to make sure that everything's written correctly. We have to make sure addendums are done properly, timelines are followed. So we are doing extra work for an unrepresented buyer. So like for me, I do a 1% charge for an unrepresented buyer. So it'll be 4%. But if I'm doing a dual representation, and this again comes back to building trust, I'm open and honest in the beginning. I say, hey, that means I'm representing 2 different clients. on the same transaction. If you're paying 3% to a buyer's agent, and this is my little twist to keep it there, is I tell them you get the friends and family with me, and it's 5% total.
Yeah,
So,
I understand. I understand. And you know, I hear everything that happens in Arizona and nothing is wrong with it. But you know, I also listen to Ron, and I believe that I should get the negotiation out of the box at first light. And I understand about commercial because you don't have those nuances in commercial real estate. But get the negotiations out of the box at the very outset so that at the end of the day, you don't have to come back. And the thing is, you go back, it happened recently to me. And you know what? My buyer paid 0.5% that the sellers wouldn't pay.
But if that doesn't happen, the issue is if you're negotiating a buyer's commission at the time of listing, and this is very clear cut in the lawsuit, you are still practicing the same way that caused the lawsuit.
Not
You are
illegal.
opening yourself up to the lawsuit.
It's not illegal.
I didn't say it was illegal, but you are opening yourself up to not clear.
Not in Florida. It's not.
no, right. So there, obviously, I think the final settlement hasn't even been signed off yet. I think I saw something to the effect where I have total fatigue over this whole settlement stuff. But I want to say, you know, I think, you know, Wilson is, you know, reading a second level into the underlying reason, and they said we can't publish that we're putting it out at 2.5%, right? But if we negotiate it and then they call and they ask, that was specifically contemplated to be allowed in the initial settlement, which I don't believe has been fully signed off on yet. But I think, you know, Wilson, what you're saying, it kind of goes to the spirit of the lawsuit, and I agree with you on that. And I know that
Hello?
I know that NAR had specifically
Hello?
hold on.
I got it.
Okay. I know that NAR had specifically had some provisions for us to be allowed to do that. Now, here's what I want to ask. And you know, Carmen, did you have something that you wanted to say? I thought you were trying to say something a moment ago.
You're on mute, Karma.
You know, she's unmuted.
Can I jump in? I was waiting for everybody else to talk.
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead, Bobby.
So if I could touch on something that Wilson said, when you're sitting with a homeowner and you say to now, and you explain to a homeowner that you're acting as a seller agent, but if you have the buyer and then you go into dual disclosed agent, what's helped me out considerably is instead of me saying I represent the buyer as well, because a seller doesn't really want to hear that, I'd say there's circumstances where I have a relationship with the buyer, or somebody from my office has a relationship with the buyer. So when you use the word relationship, it's a little bit of a softer sell with a homeowner. So I'm just trying to help out with dialogue and maybe people can use that. But the other thing that I think we're missing here is, I realize we're talking about the listing side of it, but what about the buyer agency agreement? So, you know, I'm talking about Wilson, so I'll stick with Wilson. Wilson's buyer agency agreement, let's just say for an example, his buyer agency agreement says that if the seller doesn't offer compensation, then the buyer is on the hook for the 3%. So we're trying to get it from the seller. I understand that, but the reality is if the seller is only, so Wilson's agreement says 3%. If the seller's only willing to give 2%, you put the deal together, but then you have to explain to the buyer that, hey, you're on the hook for 1%. You say, good news. I got good news for you. We put your deal together, but you're still gonna have to pay compensation, but you don't have to pay the full 3%. You only have to pay me 1%. I think we're missing that in this conversation.
And I
Firmly
agree. I totally agree, Robert, because that's what happens. And it comes back to what Rob has been saying forever. We have to have these intelligent conversations with our clients at the outset and not in the middle or the end of a transaction.
So, Karma, did you have something? And I have a comment I'm going to add, but I just want to see what your thoughts were if you had any. You're on mute there, Karma.
No, I was just asking for one more session about commercial sometime. That's all.
Okay. Yeah, we can definitely do something like that. So when somebody makes an offer, like if I call up and you know, let's just say Karma, if you're on mute, I say, "Hey Karma, great news, you know, it's Rob here with Keller Williams. I have an offer I want to make on your listing." Um, you just look for that in your email. Now, how do you how do you respond on that? Do you just wait for the offer?
Yeah, I mean, you don't have anything in writing. However, you can tell the owner, I have a call from an agent. He said he's gonna send me an offer. He's gonna email it to me, but I don't have it yet. You should you know, involve your seller, whatever, even verbally in the meantime. So
So, would anybody say, hey, Karma, what's that? You know, what's your offer coming in at? Who would say that when they say they have an offer coming in? Wilson, Robert, anybody else?
I always say,
I
give me a
would
quick
say,
rundown.
Okay, give me a quick right. And then so let's say it's a $700,000 listing and the offer's coming in at 665. What do you say, Wilson?
I say, are you guys asking for anything else? Are you asking for compensation? I mean, I want it. I want the bullet points. Give me
Okay.
the Cliff Note
All
version. We'll
right.
get done.
Now, what are the
So
other
so
terms? Yeah.
so Wilson, nothing to sell, cash offer. They sold their place in Portland. They're coming down. They're flexible with the closing. They're living with relatives now. They're 665 and they're asking for 3% compensation.
I tell them that I definitely want to see it in writing, but I'll take their verbal to my clients and we'll respond with a written contract once we receive it from them.
Would anybody say anything different?
I wouldn't take a verbal.
Well, no, you're gonna wait for it to come, but you want to know ahead of time. I probably wouldn't tell the seller until I got it in writing. Would anybody say anything different?
I would say it's at your best and final, like it's that your,
You would ask if that's the best that you can do, right?
yeah,
I would.
I would.
How about saying, you know, is your buyer flexible with the price?
Mhm.
And I bet you half the people would say, oh, you know, they have a little bit of room, right?
You made a really
I
good point. I was going to say it earlier, and you've got to actually speak with and not do this through email or text messages, because it's amazing when you ask a question like you just asked, that other agent feels like they have to answer, even though they really shouldn't say that their client is flexible on the price, because they're
right.
disclosing something they
Right.
shouldn't say. But
Right.
but it's amazing how many people will talk when they shouldn't.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
And they
would,
think they need to. They think they have to answer the question.
yeah, I mean, you could say we're negotiable, you know, or
Right, and then you might even say, Beth, you know, are you negotiable on your commission as well?
Everything's
uh,
negotiable, Rob.
You know, Beth, you know, the last offer my seller countered with a 2% commission. Are you okay with that?
Everything's negotiable. We'll have to look at the whole package before we answer that question.
And some buyers agents would fold like a cheap suit and say, oh yeah, I can do, I'll do too if that makes the deal work.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So I personally, if I were in the transaction, I would probably try to ask more questions when something comes in.
Right.
And even the way that they answer it, you can read into whether or not that's their highest and best or whether there's room. You know, if I said, you know, hey Rob, is that your is that the is your client flexible, right? Um, you know, I'm not sure. Well, let's see if we can make this work, right? I'm reading into that yeah, there's room.
Yes, for sure.
If they say, hey Beth, you know, they're at their highest point. You know, we decided to put our best possible offer together. There's no contingencies. It's a cash offer. I hope your client can add merit to the fact that there's no contingencies and we can be flexible. Like those things would be important to me, and they don't stand out in a writing or an email, do they?
They do not.
So
Got to
I
be
think,
voice to voice.
Yeah, conversation is power. Yeah.
but I think that's some of the things that you know, is not intuitive. Nobody teaches you unless you're here that, you know, these are things that you need to be intentional,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, and asking, hey, is your commission, is your buyer negotiable? Is your commission negotiable? Right? And if they say, yeah, I can go, I'll accept 2, then all of a sudden, like, you just saved your client 1%. And sometimes you feel like, oh, this is the end of the industry, like some people have called and bitched to me about, when they're negotiating our commission. Well, you know what? Everything's always been negotiable, right? And I think that, I don't know who said it, but I think a lot of our more education oriented, intentional agents are seeing better compensation on the buy side commissions because they've made an effort to have a standard of practice, right? They made an effort to know exactly what they're going to say, right? They're not just making it up as they go.
So Rob, I think that we need to take a step back too, to where we talk about the buyer agent who makes the phone call to find out the answers to the questions that the selling agent is going to ask. Like, what is the seller looking for in terms of a closing? Is there anything special that would be important to the seller for us to have in mind when we put together our offer? So that once they've had that conversation and then then, then they when they present their offer, they can say to the listing agent, remember we had the conversation and we've addressed all of the issues that the seller said was important to them. And I think that puts you in a better position with the listing agent as well as the seller.
Right. People want to transact with people they know, like, and trust, right?
Right.
And even if you don't get anything out of them, hopefully you've built some rapport, right?
Right.
Even realtor to realtor, the know, like, and trust realtor to realtor makes a difference too.
Right.
Yep.
I think that's another thing that we have as I would say older agents, that the new generation doesn't like to get on the phone. So a lot of the offers we're gonna get is a text saying offer is coming. So I think that's when we need to either pick up the phone or have a conversation, because a lot of these younger agents don't want to talk and may, to your point, say things that they're not supposed to.
Hey, Rob, can I offer up a scenario? I need help from the group.
Okay.
Right, so we had an agent in our office that represented a buyer this past week. Made the offer, listen, we're all professionals. It was an EXP listing. I'm not trying to throw them under the bus, but it's relevant to the story. So EXP says, make an offer, we'll negotiate the buyer agency compensation. So our agent went in asking for 2.5%. The feedback that the realtor gave our realtor, the listing agent gave our realtor, was that the seller says he won't pay more than 1.5%. And if the realtor doesn't agree to that, they'll send a letter out to the buyer, letting the buyer know the reason we didn't make the deal is because your realtor never agreed to 1.5%. So on the New Jersey contracts, the buyer's address is always on the contract. So there was an easy way. If this seller really wanted to do this, he could send out a letter to the buyer saying the reason we didn't make your deal is because your agent wouldn't negotiate the commission to 1.5%.
What was the BBA? What did the BBA say?
Hold on.
EXP does not offer any buyer agency compensation. It's just, submit your offer, we'll negotiate the compensation.
Right. So, I think, didn't you say, Robert, or Bobby, that, hey, I got good news. The seller's going to pay 1.5 of the 2.5%.
Correct.
And here's how I would handle it is I would say, hey, Bobby, we have a seller here that is insistent on only offering out, or only compensating 1.5%. The opportunity here is that a lot of agents are probably going to avoid this property if their buyer agency agreement is higher. Are you open to paying the additional 1% before we make the offer and see if they pay the 1%? And if they don't, I would still make the offer with the 2.5%. I would tell the buyer, and if a letter comes out, a letter comes out. I think that might even be I mean, if the EXP agent is telling them, maybe I would make the offer without the buyer's address. How's that?
That might be the solution. But based on our prior conversation, in this particular case, the buyer agency agreement is crucial, because in my opinion, I mean, our agent filled it out, but did
Right,
not fill it out to protect herself, and this is where the yin and the yang come here. So your
So
comments are helpful, Rob, but I think if the buyer agent, if our agent filled out the buyer agency agreement a little bit better, she would have been.
And negotiation starts, I think, at the BBA level. That's when you're better prepared to make an offer because you feel comfortable that your buyer is going to make up the gap if there is a
So-
gap.
So especially in New Jersey, Bobby, where I think the agents are a little bit more, expecting, um, hey, what is your client offering out? And if somebody says that they're dead set against going anything above 1.5, don't even submit an offer with 1.5. I would go back to my client and say, hey, good news. What's the good news? Is we have a seller that's going to have limited activity because of the way they're compensating buyer's agents. And as long as you're willing to cover the 1%, I think we could take advantage of that in our negotiation. And I honestly feel that the market's not trained well enough to be able to deal with this person that's paying 1.5%. What's your thoughts on that, Bobby?
All valid stuff, and then that's why I want to hear from you guys, because all week long, we've been trying to hash this out. There's been pretty robust discussions between Bobby Durso and the other manager, and we're just trying to see how other people would address this, but you have great suggestions. In our next office meeting, this is going to be part of our discussion.
Yeah, honestly, like that wouldn't, and I know that that's like irritating, potentially, but I wouldn't let it interrupt my rhythm. Like I would just keep moving on. I'd say, hey, here's how we're going to do it. The buyer's name is this, care of this address, and they say, why are you doing that? Because you said your seller's going to send a letter out. I don't think that's appropriate. Like I don't. I mean, I don't know if has anybody had more than one seller reach out to a buyer because their address was on it in your career?
Oh, it's never
No.
happened.
Never.
I've seen buyers submit letters to sellers for when their offer wasn't accepted and they thought maybe their realtor never submitted their offer. I've
Right.
seen that
But
happen.
I'm saying the other way. I
Opposite,
don't think so.
no.
Yeah.
No.
But my suggestion, like you mentioned to him, is I would never write the buyer address on the contract till it goes under contract and the lender requested or the attorney. That way you're just keeping it very vague as far as that. Also,
Right.
my suggestion is the buyer agency agreement. When you're having that conversation with the buyer, you need to let them know all the scenarios. You can't just say, okay, well, my fee is 2% or 2.5%. And every property I find will, and if we submit an offer, we'll ask the seller to pay it. You have to give them options like, hey, if I find you a property, let's say my agreement is 2.5 and the seller's only offering 2, how would you like to handle the other 0.5%? Do you want us to increase the offer to include that 0.5%? Do you want us to just submit the offer requesting it? Or are you going to pass on submitting an offer? So that way, when the seller comes back with that answer, like Bobby's agent received, you already had that conversation with your buyer where it's easier, not surprise them, be like, wait, how come you didn't tell me that this could happen? And, so I think having that clear conversation with your buyer is really crucial. You have to give them all the options before they're signing that contract, buyer agency agreement.
I agree.
I mean, in my opinion, Bobby, that's probably
Agreed.
like an ignorant position from that EXP agent. Would you agree?
Well, just to be clear to everybody, it's the seller telling the listing agent, this is what I plan on doing, then the listing agent conveyed that to our agent. So the listing agent, in my opinion, was really the messenger.
Right. But honestly, like when you go out there, don't you have tremendous influence on how that works? right? I mean, there may be an odd chance that that was the seller had that in their head that they're not going to do that. But if they told me that, I'd say, so Bobby, are you saying that if we get an offer $100,000 more and they want you to pay 3%, you're going to instruct me to refuse that?
Yeah, it's about the net. That's what I said before. You can put it all
No,
together.
but Bobby, like, do you think a seller would say if it's
I think the basic,
well, no, well, I just want Bobby, do you think a seller would say, if you have an offer for 100,000 more and they're asking for an extra 1.5%, that you want me to reject it? What would a seller say?
I'd like to think that they have enough common sense to agree to that.
Right. So therefore, I think I think there's 1 in 1 million sellers that would reject that. Right. And I think it's a weak listing agent that is the cause of that conversation.
Exactly.
So,
they're afraid to enter into a conversation with their sellers and their buyers. I think it goes back to what you said in the very beginning, Rob. If you have a conversation and you lay everything out and you give them all the scenarios, that's the way to do business.
right. And
Exactly.
I authentically feel that when somebody makes that comment to me and I'm working with a buyer, I feel like that's an opportunity for us. Right? It's an opportunity for us to take advantage of somebody who's, you know, promoting an ignorant position, in my opinion. Right?
Absolutely.
So, Bobby, what if you submitted the offer and said, look, we're taking 1.5% and we want a 3% seller concession for closing costs, and your 1% is in the closing costs?
All of this stuff is good, helpful information. Unfortunately, I found out about this after the fact. So the finish line here and the wrap up is that our agent just agreed to the 1.5% because she didn't want to cost the buyer the house, and truthfully, she panicked a little bit and she just agreed to the 1.5%. So that's really the end result. But in the future, all of this stuff that we're discussing, I'll bring up in an office meeting. So we're a little bit more astute at handling this.
Bobby, you can also encourage them to join the Tuesday Mastermind for New Jersey. This is what we really go over week after week. So they're more than welcome to join the Tuesday Mastermind.
And even this conversation we're having is very, very helpful. So I'll impress on that point.
So, if I could close out today's session with just saying that our mindset and the culture that we're in and the mindset that we have, it's limitless into what we can do. In other words, my initial reaction, my bias to some underskilled listing agent is I'm trying to exploit that to my clients' at best advantage, right? And I'm going to say to them, hey, we got great news. We have a seller here that's likely limiting activity because of their compensation model. As you know, all buyers are required to sign a buyer broker agreement at the onset. And for most buyers in this range, having to put an extra 1 to 1.5% down might limit their ability to or their interest in making an offer here. So let's figure out how we can take advantage of this. Okay, so I look at all these challenges and I try to figure out, well, what's the advantage that we can come up with what most people see as an obstruction, right? So for every obstruction, there's a benefit that you can extract from that if you're authentic, transparent, and you have good communication skills with your client. Okay. And if your client trusts us and you know that you're not going to betray that trust, right? You know that none of us here can be bought, right? But we're also entitled to get paid what we're entitled to get paid for the services that we deliver. So if you know that your integrity can't be bought, then you're going to be a lot more confident in the way that you communicate with your both buyers, sellers, landlords, tenants, everybody, investors, because you trust yourself and you know that you're giving them the best possible advice. So maybe the last piece is, everything that gets us angry can also be flipped into an opportunity, right? When you get your calls about an offer coming in, let's be intentional about how we handle that, right? Most of us probably wouldn't ask, hey, what are you asking for compensation, right? Who would feel uncomfortable asking that question? I know some of you would. So Karma, if I call you with an offer, would you ask me what am I looking for as compensation when the offer comes in?
Okay, so you are talking about the buyer's agent asking me about his compensation?
I'm calling about your $700,000 listing, and I want to put an offer in for 670.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Karma, I got an offer coming in. Do you ask what it is, or do you wait for it to come in?
Well, in the meantime, I would really like to have it in writing in the meantime, because sometime
Well,
we need.
no. I would never accept the verbal, but I would get in the habit of saying, Karma, you know, um, please no, I'm not going to submit anything until it's in writing. But can you share what is your offer coming in at? Right? And I'm not going to tell it to my client until it comes in writing. So I'm coming in at 670.
Mhm. Well,
You know, you-
if the buyer's agent tell me that information, I will just tell him, is your actually buyer is negotiable? Can he negotiate it? So, and in the meantime, I have conversation with the seller.
So
My
I would say this, Karma, and I'm sorry to
Sure.
interrupt because I know we're like 1 minute over. I would say, is your client flexible, right? Instead of negotiable,
Okay.
right? Is your client flexible, right?
Yeah.
And see if they volunteer. Well, they have a little bit of room, right?
Mhm.
This is what a lot of people would say, right?
Mhm.
And then I would say, great. What's the closing date, and what compensation are you asking, right? And if they're saying, hey, I want 3. And let's say you have it at 2.5 and your client's probably expecting to pay 2 to 2.5. You might say, hey, are you flexible or are you negotiable with your fee? Okay. And they
Mhm.
may answer, they may not, but I don't think that's offensive, and I wouldn't be offended to ask it.
Okay.
Right. Especially if we're not in the mindset of saying, hey, my client is putting out 2.5% minus $200, right? Or my client's paying 2%. I like the Arizona way. And I would say when somebody does have the intellect to call you about an offer, let's not just say, okay, I'll look for it in my email. Let's ask some questions about it. Worst case, you get nothing, right? They say, well, all this will be included in the email and the cover letter. Great. But if you can feel them out, even better. So that's the gift for today. Everybody, have a great, great weekend. I hope this was helpful. And, if you have any individual questions, reach out to your leadership team or myself.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Have a great
Rob.
one.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rob.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Rob.
Thanks, Rob.
Thank you. Happy
Great
Friday.
session. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.